Can everyone hear me? Hello, hello. Excellent. So I hope some of you saw Carolyn Steele earlier this evening. It's wonderful to be able to be part of a food-centered sort of day. All very nice. So, as I get started, I want to talk a little bit about MFK Fisher in general. The book I'm going to be reading from this evening is this one, MFK Fisher's The Art of Eating, and there are several books. Hi, Alicia. There are several books contained within it. I'll go ahead and start with the introduction now. Good evening, and welcome to the Architecture Foundation's 100-day studio, Bedtime Stories, created and curated by Alicia Pivaro. My name is Tim Waterman, and I lecture in landscape architecture and architecture history and theory at the Bartlett School of Architecture in London. My research and writing stretches across three vast fields of theory: landscape studies, food studies, and utopian studies. Now, you could very well complain to me that these aren't specialisms, but rather that I'm just writing about everything. This would be true, in fact, but academia likes to put knowledge into boxes, so I've just chosen three boxes that contain everything. Tonight's featured author is MFK Fisher, Mary Frances Kennedy Fisher, who is guilty of precisely the same ambition, in this case to write about everything through the medium of food. She has always been thought of as a food writer, and the publishing industry's love of genres, they have their own boxes, just like academe, means that she's never had as wide a readership as she truly deserves. She is, however, undoubtedly one of the very greatest writers of the 20th century in any genre, with the most elegantly and closely observed prose style. So tonight's reading is of the memoir The Gastronomical Me, which was published in 1943, but which takes us from the early teens, when MFK Fisher was a child, right up until the beginning of the war. So we'll see some fascists circulating partway through the text. It's a very personal reading, but I think what it does is it speaks about architecture from the point of view of occupation, of what it is to live and dwell in spaces, to cook in a small kitchen, to throw open a window, to walk out across the doorstep. So if you can look at those kinds of things in this reading, I'm sure you'll find them there. So I'm going to begin with MFK Fisher's forwards. For those of you who've just joined, this is a reading from The Gastronomical Me by MFK Fisher, published in 1943. And I'm going to begin. I'm going to read a series of selections starting in 1912 and ending up around 1939. So we'll get a long stretch of time. Her foreword to this, only a couple of paragraphs long, is one of my favorite forewords in any book. And pardon me while I fortify myself, and I know that MFK Fisher would approve. A deep glass of whiskey is important to read about food and life. People ask me, why do you write about food and eating and drinking? Why don't you write about the struggle for power and security and about love the way others do? They ask it accusingly, as if I were somehow gross, unfaithful to the honor of my craft. The easiest answer is to say that, like most other humans, I'm hungry. But there's more than that. It seems to me that our three basic needs for food and security and love are so mixed and mingled and entwined that we cannot straightly think of one without the others. So it happens that when I write of hunger, I'm really writing about love and the hunger for it, and warmth and the love of it and the hunger for it, and then the warmth and richness of fine reality of hunger satisfied, and it is all one. I tell about myself and how I ate bread on a lasting hillside or drank red wine in a room now blown to bits from the war, of course, and it happens without my willing that I'm telling too much about the people with me then and their other deeper needs for love and happiness. There's food in the bowl, and more often than not, because of what honesty I have, there is nourishment in the heart to feed the wilder, more insistent hungers. We must eat. If, in the face of that dread fact, we can find other nourishment, and tolerance, and compassion for it, we'll be no less full of human dignity. There's a communion of more than our bodies when bread is broken and wine drunk, and that is my answer when people ask me, why do you write about hunger and not wars or love? Fisher writes a series of chapters which are all called The Measure of My Powers. This comes from an epigraph that she has at the beginning of the book from Santayana, which says, "To be happy you must have taken the measure of your powers, tasted the fruits of your passion, and learned your place in the world." So the measure of her powers begins in 1912 when she's a child, and this is her earliest food memory, with her very stern grandmother in the kitchen. The first thing I remember tasting, and then wanting to taste again, is the greyish-pink fuzz my grandmother skimmed from a spitting kettle of strawberry jam. I suppose I was about 4. Women in those days made much more of a ritual of their household duties than they do now. Sometimes it was indistinguishable from a dogged, if unconscious, martyrdom. There were times for this, and other equally definite times for that. There was one set week a year for the sewing woman. Of course, there was the spring cleaning, and there were other periods, almost like festivals, in that they disrupted normal life, which were observed no matter what the weather, finances, or health of the family. Many of them seem odd or foolish to me now, but probably the whole staid rhythm lent a kind of rich excitement to the housebound flight of time. With us, for the first years of my life, there was a series every summer of short but violently active cannings. Crates and baskets and lug boxes of fruit bought in their prime and at their cheapest would lie waiting in the opulent fragrance on the screened porch, and a whole battery of enameled pots and ladles and wide-mouthed funnels would appear from some dark cupboard. All I knew then about the actual procedure was that we had delightful picnic meals, while grandmother and mother and the cook worked with a kind of drugged concentration in our big dark kitchen, and were tired and cross, and at the same time oddly triumphant in their race against summer heat and the processes of rot. Now I know that strawberries came first, mostly for jams. Sour red cherries for pies and darker ones for preserves were a little later. And then came the apricots. They were for jam, and if they were very ripe, the solid ones were simply put up. That is, in my grandmother's language, meant cooking with little sugar to eat for breakfast or dinner in the winter, which she still thought of in terms of northern Iowa. They were at the time living in California. She was a grim woman, as if she had decided long ago that she could thus most safely get to heaven. I have a feeling that my father might have liked to help with the cannings, just as I longed to. But grandmother, with that almost joyfully stern bowing to duty typical of religious women, made it clear that helping in the kitchen was a bitter, heavy business, forbidden certainly to men, and generally to children. Sometimes she let me pull stems off the cherries, and one year, when I was almost 9, I stirred the pots a little now and then, silent and making myself as small as possible. But there was no nonsense anyway, no foolish chit-chat. Mother was still young and often gay, and the cook too. And with grandmother directing operations, they all worked in a harried muteness. Stir, sweat, hurry. It was a pity. Such a beautifully smelly task should be fun, I thought. In spite of any late Victorian asceticism, though, the hot kitchen sent out tantalizing clouds, and the fruit on the porch lay rotting in its crates, or readied for the pots and the wooden spoons, in fair, glowing piles upon the juice-stained tables. Grandmother, saving always, stood like a sacrificial priestess in the steam, skimming into a thick white saucer, and I, sometimes permitted and more often not, put my finger in the cooling froth and licked it. Warm and sweet and odorous. I loved it then. The next measure of my powers is from the years 1929 to 1930, where she travels with her husband Al to Paris and finds Paris not much to her liking at that moment, and then goes on to Dijon. A little background here is that she comes from a middle-class American background where a certain amount of intellectual striving and a desire for acculturation is the badge of her class. You'll find some narrow people along the way, but for the most part, the sort of American family that I grew up into was very much the kind of family that she is. So she struggled in Europe as a young woman with a young husband, staying in boarding houses. So the elegance of her writing tells you that she's posh, but actually everything about the reality of her life is that she was really trying very hard to get where she was going. So the next measure of my powers, 1929 to 1930, Paris. Paris was everything that I had dreamed the late September when we first went there. It should always be seen the first time with the eyes of childhood or of love. I was almost 21, but much younger than girls are now, I think. And I was wrapped in a passionate mist. Al and I stayed on the Quai Voltaire. That was before the trees were cut down, and in the morning I would stand on our balcony and watch him walk slowly along by the bookstalls and wave to him if he looked up at me. Then I would get into bed again. The hot chocolate and the rich croissants were the most delicious things, there in bed with the Seine flowing past me and pigeons wheeling around the grey palace mansards that I had ever eaten. They were really the first thing I'd tasted since we were married, tasted to remember. They were a part of the warmth and excitement of that hotel room with Paris waiting. But Paris was too full of people that we knew. Al's friends, most of them on the long vac from English universities, were full of Lady Chatterley's lover and the addresses of quaint little restaurants where everybody spoke in very clipped, often newly acquired British accents and drank sparkling Burgundy. My friends, most of them middle-aged women living in Paris on allowances from their American husbands because of the exchange, were expensive, generous, foolish souls who needed several champagne cocktails at the Ritz bar after their daily shopping, and were improving their French by reading a page a week of Maurois' Ariel. Al and I got out as soon as we politely could, or a little sooner, not downcast, because we knew we would come back. On the way to Dijon, we had lunch in the courtyard of the old Post Hotel in Avallon. We were motoring down with two large, soft Chicago women who were heading for Italy, mainly, it seemed, because they simply couldn't sit for 5 minutes in a restaurant in Rome without being subtly assaulted by lovesick army officers. Italians appreciate mature women, they said, their chaste bosoms heaving with a kind of innocent yearning lechery I have often noticed in American females of their class. I remember that once on the road, when the chauffeur got out to look at the wheel, his coat flapped open as he bent over. Both of our companions squeaked at what they saw and hustled out of the car. They asked a question in dreadful Italian and whipped back the lapels of their own traveling suits. And then the fat, shifty-looking driver and the two elegant middle-aged women stood in the dust, their eyes fixed on one another's magic, enameled fascist party pins, so carefully hidden until now, and the three of them solemnly saluted, chins out, just like Mussolini in the newsreels. Al and I were oddly embarrassed and did not look at each other. The hotel in Avallon, because of its ancient location on the Paris-Lyon post road, had inevitably been taken over by a noted chef, with all the accompanying shishi. I went back, this is at the advent of the time of the Michelin guides, which encouraged people to take their cars and burn rubber, Michelin tires, out in the countryside and visit these hotels and restaurants that were popular at the time. I went back there several times in the next few years because it was convenient and the redecorated bedrooms were comfortable. The kitchen wall into the courtyard had been replaced by an enormous window, I remember, and the swanky motorists who stopped there for lunch and the modern water closets could watch the great cook and his minions moving like pale fish behind the glass. The food was not bad, but not very good when you knew what it might have been under such a once famous man. But that September noon in 1929, when Al and I ate in the courtyard with the two kind, silly women, and feeling ourselves getting nearer and nearer to Dijon, one important thing happened. We were hungry, and everything tasted good, but I forget now what we ate, except for a kind of soufflé of potatoes. It was hot, light, with a brown crust, and probably chives and grated Parmesan cheese was somewhere in it. But the great thing about it was that it was served alone in a course all by itself. I felt a secret justification swell in me, a pride such as I've seldom known since, because all my life, it seemed, I'd been wondering rebelliously about potatoes. I didn't care much for them, except for one furtive and largely unsatisfying period of yearning for mashed potatoes with ketchup on them when I was about 11. I almost resented them, in fact, or rather the monotonous disinterest with which they were always treated. I felt that they could be good if they were cooked respectfully. At home we had them at least once a day, with meat. You didn't say meat, you said meat and potatoes. They were mashed, baked, boiled, and when grandmother was away, fixed in a casserole with cream sauce and called, somewhat optimistically, O'Brien. It was shameful, I always felt, and stupid, too, to reduce a potentially important food to such a menial position, and to take every day to cook it doggedly with a perfunctory compulsion. If I ever had my way, I thought, I would make such delicious things of potatoes that they would be a whole meal, and never would I think of them as the last part of the word meat. And now, here in the sunny courtyard of the first really French restaurant I'd ever been in, I saw my theory proved. It was a fine moment. We stayed at the Cloche in Dijon for a few days, mainly because it was the biggest and best-known place in town. We knew too little yet to appreciate its famous cellars, and found the meals fairly dull in the big, grim dining room. Later, we learned that once a year, in November, for the Foire Gastronomique, it recaptured for those days all its old glitter. Then it was full of gourmets from every corner of France, and famous chefs twirled saucepans in its kitchens, and wine buyers drank Chambertins and Cortons and Romanée Contis by the cave full. But for us it was not the place to be, and while Al was blissfully submerging himself in the warm, safe bath of university life, filling out scholarly questionnaires and choosing his own library corner for writing, which he soon exchanged for a quiet table at the Café de Paris, I hopped in and out of fiacres looking for a flat to live in. The streets were narrow and crooked in the district around the Faculté, and at that time of year rich with a fruity odor of cellars, dog dirt, and the countless public urinals needed in a wine town. In all the little squares, yellowing chestnut leaves fell slowly down, and fountains spouted. I felt very happy when I started out, with a discreetly small dictionary in one hand and the university list of approved boarding houses in the other. The horse wore a straw hat with red crochet gloves for his ears sticking out of the crown, and there were cafes everywhere, so that Even if I took only one quick, dismayed glance at the next place on my list, my driver had a time for a drink and remained cheerful. When I remember now how tired I got and how discouraged, I think I should have joined him, at least once out of every 4 or 5 times. The house we were to live in for the next 2 years, and where a part of me will always be, was the first one I saw. It was near the Faculté. It was perfect. But I didn't know that until I'd seen a few of the others on their list. It was a real Burgundian townhouse in 2 parts, one on the street and the other at the back. Beyond a deep, narrow courtyard, a covered stairway zigzagged up one side of the court, connecting the 2 halves floor by floor, and the rooms I looked at were on the top, in the back part. There was a narrow, deep room with a big bed and an armoire in it, and another even narrower room with a couch and a desk and shelves. There was a little closet off the stairs with running cold water in a tiny wash bowl and a 1-burner gas plate. There was a big window in each room looking down into the hard grey little court, and there was steam heat. The bedroom was papered in mustard and black stripes, about 8 inches wide, with a wide band of American Beauty roses around the ceiling. The smaller one was in several shades of purple and lavender with brown accents. A more feminine decor, the landlady pointed out. In the little closet were all the necessities, a potty, a kidney-shaped pan on legs, but down in the court there was also a real toilet, with a pitcher of water and a neat pile of newspapers beside it. You pulled a handle which flapped back the bottom of the toilet, and you could look right down into the gurgling waters of the ancient Dijon sewer. There was also a bathroom on the ground floor, and the landlady assured me that for 7 francs, or 6 if we used our own soap, a bath could be drawn at only a few hours' notice. The entrance to the whole place was a normal-sized door cut in the great double door that once had let carriages into the courtyard, under the front half of the house, and on one side was the bathroom, and on the other, in what had probably been the doorkeeper's room, was the dining room. There the landlady told me we would eat well, 3 times a day, with her husband, her stepson, 1 or 2 carefully selected students, and herself. I bowed myself into my fiacre, not knowing what a jewel I thus nonchalantly toyed with. 3 or 4 hours later, after looking at a dozen places without water, without heat, certainly without bath, but all with a dank smell which I had not caught in the house on the Petit Poté, I hurried back as fast as the weary hack would pull me. It was the opening of a new season at the Faculté. Dijon was probably teeming with students, all more sensible than I. I was a fool! Central heating! A real toilet! A nice smell! It was growing dark when I pulled myself for the last time out of the fiacre. I banged on the little door in the big door, and someone shrieked harshly to come in. Madame Beauharnais darted from the kitchen, which lay just beyond the dining room, onto the first rise of the staircase. She had on a filthy apron, and I could hear someone rattling pans and chopping and beating. Madame pushed her henna'd hair back on her forehead, assured me that I had the air well fatigued, and said that the rooms were still free. I almost cried. I gave her all the money I had, even without getting Al's opinion first, and said haltingly that we would arrive the next noon. We? She said, with a sharp, mocking voice that I was to know very well and grow fond of. Yes, my husband. I'm married. She laughed loudly. All right, bring your friend along, she said, but there was nothing mean in her voice. Voir Titzel, she called hurriedly, and disappeared into the kitchen as I closed the door and climbed wearily into the fiacre. Before we could start, she came shrieking out onto the narrow sidewalk with a scrawled piece of wrapping paper in her hand, a receipt for what I had paid for her. I turned back to smile at her as we drove off. She was standing with one foot over the high door sill, hands rolled in her apron, watching me with a mixture of affection and innate scorn, which I soon learned she felt for all creatures, but mostly humans. So, I'm going to carry on. I've got 2 more short sections to read. And the next section is in 1931, when she and her husband Al got their first place all to themselves, not a boarding house. And then the final reading where she talks about dining alone, which I think is one of the most exquisite things ever written by a woman in English. But this about the apartment. Our apartment was 2 floors above a pastry shop. Au Fin Gourmet, which was very clean and airy and with a nice smell. The smell was what made me decide to take it after days of backing confusedly out of brothels and looking at rooms dark and noisome and as lewdly suggestive as the old crones who showed them to me. We signed several official certificates, bending over peach tarts and a row of soggy babas to reach the ink bottle. The proprietor looked at our signatures and asked, "Married?" "Yes," Al said, raising one eyebrow almost invisibly, in a way that meant, in those days at least, that in spite of his politely innocent manner, his words carried a tremendous reprimand or correction or general social commentary. "Yes, you see, we have the same name, and I have marked us as Monsieur and Madame." "Well," the man said, "it is less than nothing to me, you understand, but the police must be satisfied." He looked amicably at us, wiped his hands on his sugary apron, and marked out Madame, as my profession, as student. In place of it he wrote Monsieur Fisher and woman. His wife, a snappish-looking small woman with pink eyebrows and tight mouth, gave us our keys and warned us again that the chambers were now in perfect condition and we were expected to remain that way, and we went up the stairs to our own private home for the first time in our lives. There was a big room with a shiny but uneven tiled floor and 2 wide windows looking down onto the dusty little square. The bed, half in, half out, a little alcove, did not keep everything from looking spacious and pleasant, especially when we pushed the round table into the corner and put books on the fake mantelpiece under the wavy old mirror. There was a kind of cupboard which Madame, the owner, had called La Chambre Noire. We got some candles for it, and turned one of our trunk tops into a washstand, and it was very matter-of-fact in spite of its melodramatic name. Outside our front door on the landing was a little faucet where we got water for washing and cooking. It was a chore to carry it, and even more of one to empty the pail from the black chamber and the dishwater and what I washed vegetables in, but it was something so new I did not mind it much. There was a fountain in the square, of course, and I soon learned to take my lettuces and such down there and let the spout run over them, like the other women in the quarter. The kitchen was astonishing to me because I had never lived in a place like New York, where people cook on stoves hidden in bureau drawers, I've heard. It was perhaps 5 feet long, perhaps 3 wide, and I had to keep the door open into the other room when I stood at the 2-burner gas plate. There was a little tin oven, the kind to be set on top of a stove, and a kind of box with 2 shelves in it for storage and instead of a table. And there was the window, one whole wall, which opened wide and looked down into the green, odorous square and out over the twisted chimney pots to the skies of the Côte d'Or. It was a wonderful window, one of the best I can remember, and what I saw and thought and felt as I stood in it with my hands on the food for us those months will always be a good part of me. So the next reading, again, a quite short section now, and the last. She's writing after she's broken up with her first husband, Al, and is traveling, I believe, at this point alone. And there's a bit of a sexual frisson to this as well, which is nice. She was a woman who was in love with the world, in love with food, and in love with all of the sensuality that it offers us as well. So this is from a chapter from 1938, right at the dawn of the war, called The Lemming to the Sea. And this is where I'll leave you. And this is one of my favorite pieces of writing ever. And as someone who ran a restaurant and watched women dine alone, I really feel for this. More often than not, people who see me on trains and in ships or in restaurants feel a kind of resentment of me since I taught myself to enjoy being alone. Women are puzzled, which they hate to be, and jealous of the way I'm served with such agreeable courtesy, and of what I am eating and drinking, which is almost never the sort of thing They order for themselves. And men are puzzled too in a more personal way. I anger them as males. I'm sorry. I do not like to do that, or puzzle the women either. But if I must be alone, I refuse to be alone as if it were something weak and distasteful like convalescence. Men see me eating in public and look as if I knew my way around. And yet I make it plain that I know my way around without them. And that upsets them. I know what I want, and I usually get it because I'm adaptable to locales. I order meals that are more typically masculine than feminine, if feminine means whipped cream and cherries. I like good wines, or good drinking liquor, and beers and ales. And I like waiters. I think the woman who said that waiters are much nicer than people was right. And quite often waitresses are too. So they are always nice to me, which is a sure way to annoy other diners whose soup quite often they would like to spit into. And all these reasons, and probably 1,000 others, like the way I wear my hair or what shade my lipstick is, makes people look strangely at me, resentfully, with a kind of hurt bafflement when I dine alone. Sometimes the results are more tangible. I think now of Jacques. He was on the Île-de-France, the ship that she was on, when I went back to Switzerland. By then I'd fairly well developed my system of public behavior, but the ship was a hard test, bleak, rattling, stuffy in second, and heartbreakingly pretentious in first. Jacques and I were in second. I saw him soon, and enjoyed the way he moved quietly about the decks and halls like a Spanish dancer, very self-contained. He was small and dark, and made me think of a fox, not because of the cunning a fox is supposed to have, but because of a smooth, fine, brown-eyed potency about him. He was looking at me, and admiring me too, but I did not realize it. My whole reason for being lay ahead of me, on the lake near Vevey, in the canton of Vaud, and I was hurrying there as irrevocably as an Arctic lemming hurries to the sea cliff, through poisoned fields and fire and flood to what he longs for. So that concludes the reading from MFK Fisher, Mary Frances Kennedy Fisher of 1943, the marvelous book, The Gastronomical Me. Thank you all for joining me this evening. I hope you enjoyed it. And no one is going to eat an ortolan. I see that. Enjoy your evening all, and thank you again. I hope MFK Fisher was a revelation. Now I need to figure out how to end.